December 16, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Western Front. The trees stood frozen in silence, their branches heavy with snow. Beneath them, a line of German Panther tanks idled, engines rumbling softly in the bitter cold. Their crews waited, confident, disciplined, and ready. For weeks, German High Command had promised one final blow that would break the Allies apart, drive them back into the sea, and buy Germany the time it needed to survive. At dawn, the thunder began. Shells screamed over the treetops, lighting the horizon in bursts of orange and white. American positions along the front, tired, thinly spread, and largely unsuspecting, vanished beneath waves of artillery. Yet beneath that chaos, in foxholes and frozen trenches, the U.S. Army did not collapse. Convoys began to move before orders arrived. Fuel columns shifted south. Engineers rebuilt shattered bridges overnight. American logistics, that invisible machine of war, came alive. And in those critical winter weeks, as Germany threw its last strength into the Ardennes, it learned something it had long denied, that America was not just another enemy. It was built different. When the Second World War began in 1939, the United States stood far from the front lines. Europe burned under the rapid advance of German blitzkrieg. Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, one after another, nations fell with breathtaking speed. German generals, backed by a rearmed industry and a population still scarred by the humiliation of Versailles, believed they had uncovered the formula for modern war: speed, precision, and ruthless efficiency. Across the Atlantic, America watched. Isolationist at heart, still scarred by the First World War, the U.S. Congress and public sentiment leaned heavily against another European entanglement. Yet deep within its borders, a quiet transformation was already underway. Industrialists, engineers, and military planners were studying the war in Europe with meticulous attention. The lesson was clear: the next global conflict would be won not only by bravery or strategy, but by production, logistics, and endurance. By mid-1940, Germany had conquered most of continental Europe. Britain stood alone, its skies dark with the smoke of the Battle of Britain. Hitler's generals looked westward across the Channel and eastward toward the Soviet Union. To them, America seemed distant, industrially impressive, but militarily unprepared. The German General Staff's intelligence assessments viewed the United States as a sleeping industrial giant, years away from effective mobilization. They were right, but only for a moment. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything. Overnight, America's slow-boiling preparations ignited into a national crusade. Factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and radios retooled for tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt called it, began to awaken. In 1942 alone, the United States produced over 47,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and more ships than the entire Axis could build in a decade. Entire industrial cities emerged almost overnight, places like Willow Run, where Ford's assembly lines produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The scale defied comprehension. Yet numbers alone didn't explain America's difference. It was how the system functioned, decentralized yet synchronized, guided by logistics officers who treated warfare like a supply chain equation. Trains moved across the continent on tight schedules, ports expanded capacity by round-the-clock labor, and entire convoys were organized like living arteries feeding the warfront. When the first American forces landed in North Africa in late 1942 under Operation Torch, their early performance seemed uneven. German commanders mocked the Green Americans, noting tactical inexperience and slow battlefield reactions. But behind those early struggles, something invisible was taking shape: a logistical network that could feed, arm, and reinforce armies across oceans. The German war machine, by contrast, was beginning to show its limits. Though tactically superior in the field, it relied on fragile supply lines, inadequate fuel production, and an economy stretched thin by total war. Even as panzer divisions struck deep into Russia, German industry struggled to replace lost equipment. Meanwhile, the United States, untouched by bombing, rich in oil, steel, and manpower, kept expanding. By 1943, American production dwarfed that of Germany and Japan combined. It wasn't just quantity, it was reliability. Every Sherman tank, every Liberty ship, every C-47 transport was part of an intricate ecosystem that sustained the Allied advance. This imbalance of endurance, invisible at first, would shape the rest of the war. And by late 1944, it would confront Germany in a way that no general could deny, not on paper, but on the frozen battlefields of the Ardennes. The day Germany found out how America was built different was approaching fast. By the end of 1943, the war had become a test of endurance. Germany still held most of Europe, but its position was eroding beneath the surface. Factories were overworked, oil fields strained, and Allied bombers now reached deep into the Reich. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was bleeding aircraft and pilots faster than it could replace them. Meanwhile, America had done something no other nation in modern history had achieved. It had turned its entire civilian infrastructure into a war-making organism. The American home front became a second battlefield, one fought not with rifles, but with wrenches, blueprints, and raw determination. In Detroit, automobile plants ran 24 hours a day, lights glowing like cities unto themselves. Women took places at assembly lines, riveting aircraft frames, welding tank hulls, and testing munitions. Across the Midwest, railways pulsed with the movement of men and steel. Every ton of ore mined, every barrel of oil refined, was another promise of endurance. The United States had no occupied territory, no air raids to halt its industry, and no shortage of resources. German planners could not comprehend such conditions. They had built their empire on rapid conquest and tight, centralized control, an empire that fed off the resources of others. America's strength, by contrast, came from scale, decentralization, and efficiency. By 1944, the Allies' combined war output was staggering. The United States alone produced nearly two-thirds of all munitions used by the Allied powers. Its shipyards launched vessels faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them. Liberty ships, assembled from prefabricated parts, could be built in weeks. But production was only half the story. The real secret, the reason Germany would come to realize how different America was, lay in logistics. The U.S. Army had designed something unprecedented, a global supply system spanning every theater of war. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, a river of supplies flowed constantly. Quartermasters tracked millions of tons of equipment, from bullets to boots, and ensured they arrived exactly where they were needed. This coordination relied on the newly developed science of operations research, advanced communication networks, and near-limitless manpower. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, American engineers and planners solved problems that seemed impossible. How to move an army across an ocean, how to sustain it once ashore. The answer came in the form of the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports constructed in secrecy and assembled off the coast of Normandy within days of D-Day. To German observers, it was beyond comprehension. Even before the first Sherman tank rolled into France, the logistical victory had been won. And as the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the Western Allies pushed deep into Europe. Hitler's empire was collapsing, but the Führer refused to accept defeat. He believed one final offensive, one decisive strike, could fracture the Allied coalition and force the West to negotiate. The plan was audacious, a surprise winter assault through the Ardennes aimed at splitting the British and American armies, capturing Antwerp and surrounding Allied forces in Belgium. It was risky, but Germany had no other card left to play. Hitler's generals warned that the Reich lacked the fuel, the reserves, and the air cover for such an operation. Yet the order was given. Codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, it would become the last major German offensive of the war. In December 1944, as snow blanketed the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces gathered in silence. They faced largely inexperienced American divisions, units resting after months of fighting. To the Germans, this seemed a chance to prove that discipline, surprise, and ferocity could still overcome industrial might. But what followed would reveal the true scale of what America had become, a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Ardennes would not just decide the fate of Germany's last gamble, it would expose the unshakable foundation beneath America's power, the human angle, the American soldier. The snow was knee-deep, the cold unrelenting. In December 1944, the American lines stretched thin across the Ardennes. Most units stationed there believed the war was nearly over. They were resting, rearming, refitting, preparing for the final push into Germany. Then the thunder came. When the first shells landed, chaos erupted. Communications cut off, roads clogged with refugees, and entire outposts vanished beneath artillery fire. Yet amid the confusion, ordinary American soldiers, young men from Iowa farms, New York factories, and Texas ranches held on. The strength of the U.S. Army wasn't only in its machines, it was in its people. Soldiers who had grown up with abundance, technology, and problem-solving mindsets adapted fast. When supply lines broke, they scavenged and improvised. When radios failed, they relayed messages by jeep, bicycle, or runner. To the Germans, trained in rigid command structures, this flexibility was alien. American units could lose officers and still fight effectively. Junior leaders made decisions on the spot. Small groups organized ambushes, repaired bridges, and coordinated defenses without waiting for orders. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne became the embodiment of that resilience. Surrounded, freezing, and out of ammunition, they refused to surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's legendary one-word reply to the German demand for surrender, "Nuts," became a symbol of American defiance. But beyond the defiance was something deeper, belief. These men fought not for conquest, but for survival, theirs, their comrades, and their country's vision of a world free from tyranny. The Germans realized that morale, too, was part of America's strength, an unquantifiable energy that no amount of precision or experience could match. The tactical angle, flexibility versus rigidity. Germany's military doctrine was built on Auftragstaktik mission-type tactics, emphasizing initiative. Yet by late 1944, the Wehrmacht's command system had become suffocatingly centralized. Hitler's direct interference crippled flexibility. Commanders were forced to follow unrealistic orders, unable to adapt to the realities on the ground. In contrast, the U.S. Army operated through a web of coordination. Corps and division commanders maintained constant communication with logistics, engineers, and air support. When the German offensive began, chaos did not paralyze the Americans, it triggered automatic adaptation. Within 48 hours of the first attack, American generals Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, and George S. Patton were already shifting entire corps across hundreds of miles. The system of decentralized planning and rapid execution, supported by reliable transport and fuel, allowed the U.S. to move faster than the enemy expected. Patton's Third Army, for instance, turned its entire front 90 degrees north in a matter of days to relieve Bastogne. German commanders were astonished. Such large-scale maneuvering under winter conditions and heavy opposition seemed impossible. But it was. It was logistics, training, and mindset, all working as one, the technological angle and machines of industry. The Battle of the Bulge was not only a clash of armies, it was a collision of two industrial philosophies. Germany's weaponry, Tigers, Panthers, V-2 rockets, was technologically advanced, but expensive, complex, and slow to produce. Each Tiger tank required over 300,000 man-hours to assemble, using rare materials Germany could barely afford. America's approach was the opposite: simplicity, reliability, and scale. The M4 Sherman tank, criticized by some for its thin armor, could be built quickly, maintained easily, and transporting anywhere. Its parts were interchangeable, its engines reliable in every climate. During the Ardennes Offensive, this difference became decisive. While German tanks often broke down due to fuel shortages or mechanical strain, American forces could repair or replace theirs almost immediately. Replacement vehicles, ammunition, and supplies flowed constantly from depots in France and Belgium. Even the skis reflected that imbalance. The Luftwaffe, weakened and underfueled, barely managed to support ground troops. Once the weather cleared, Allied air power returned, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and B-26 Marauders cutting German columns to pieces. For every Panther tank destroyed, American factories could build 10 more Shermans. For every convoy hit, another left port the same day. It was not elegance or precision that overwhelmed Germany, it was sheer, unstoppable consistency. As snow turned to mud and the offensive slowed, the German high command began to see the truth. They were fighting not just soldiers, but a system, an industrial civilization capable of waging global war without pause. That was the first half of the Angles section, the human, tactical, and technological dimensions of why America was built different. Leadership angle, command by trust. War reveals not just technology, but temperament. In 1944, American leadership displayed a quality that Germany's high command had largely lost: trust in subordinates. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, operated not through fear or absolute obedience, but through coordination and delegation. Eisenhower's calm, methodical style allowed strong personalities like Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery to argue, adapt, and execute independently. Disagreements were common, but the system thrived on diversity of thought. Hitler's command system, on the other hand, had collapsed into autocracy. He demanded obedience even in the face of obvious failure. Field marshals who questioned him were dismissed, threatened, or ignored. As a result, brilliant tactical minds like Guderian and Model could only watch as irrational orders led to catastrophe. During the Ardennes Offensive, that difference became visible in every movement. While German units waited for approval to retreat or redeploy, American commanders acted. Bradley shifted his entire command boundary to allow Patton's army to pivot north. Eisenhower approved the move within hours, a flexibility that stunned even British observers. Trust, not terror, powered the American command structure. Officers were expected to think, not merely obey, and when the front threatened to collapse, that thinking saved it. The speed of decision-making, grounded in shared doctrine, open communication, and mutual respect, embodied a military culture that valued initiative over hierarchy. That culture, forged in democracy and industrial collaboration, was Germany's opposite. It was leadership designed for scale, capable of managing millions of soldiers across continents. In the frozen forests of Belgium, that system proved its worth: the enemy's angle, shock, and realization. From the German perspective, the Ardennes Offensive began brilliantly. Surprise was total, fog concealed movement, American lines cracked, German spearheads reached within miles of the Meuse River. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible, one last miracle on the Western Front. But soon, reality intruded. The offensive began to stall, not from enemy resistance alone, but from the invisible weight of American logistics. Fuel convoys could not keep pace, supply lines stretched too thin. The carefully planned timetable unraveled within days. Captured German officers later described their astonishment. One tank commander noted, "We expected confusion and retreat. Instead, the Americans came back faster than we advanced." Another recalled watching columns of U.S. trucks pouring reinforcements into the line as if their reserves were endless. For many in the Wehrmacht, this was the first true confrontation with the American system at full scale. They had faced Soviet manpower, British resilience, and partisan warfare, but never industrial omnipresence. Every destroyed tank seemed instantly replaced, every gap in the line refilled. The deeper they pushed, the clearer it became. The United States was fighting a different kind of war, one that combined industrial abundance with individual resolve. The Germans had sought to win through speed and surprise. America won through endurance and replacement. By the end of December, the offensive had burned itself out. The snow that once covered advancing panzers now buried them. German columns, out of fuel, abandoned vehicles and marched home on foot. For many, it was the first time they admitted The Reich could no longer fight a war against such a machine. The moral and cultural angle, the power of a nation united. Behind the front lines, the difference was cultural as much as industrial. America's war effort was not built on conquest or racial ideology. It was built on mobilization and shared purpose. The war bond drives, the factory shifts, the rationing, and the propaganda all spoke to one theme: unity through effort. In Germany, fear sustained production. In America, participation did. Citizens believed in their contribution, whether building aircraft or writing letters to the front. The idea that democracy could outproduce dictatorship seemed unthinkable before the war, yet by 1944 it was an undeniable truth. The American war machine was not perfect. It was wasteful, often improvised, and sometimes chaotic. But it worked because millions of ordinary people believed in it. From the Navajo Code talkers to the African-American truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, every element of society contributed to a system that never stopped moving. Even German prisoners of war remarked on the difference. Many were stunned by the food, the order, the mechanical abundance of the American camps. They realized that this was not just another industrial power. It was a civilization built on innovation, freedom, and relentless productivity. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended, that realization had spread from foxholes to the highest levels of German command. America's strength was not merely military, it was systemic, a convergence of democracy, technology, and national purpose. And as the snow melted over the shattered Ardennes, Germany finally understood what built different truly meant. From human endurance to industrial might, every angle pointed to the same truth. The United States had created a form of warfare that could not be outpaced or outlasted. Next came the moment when that truth became undeniable, when Germany's last offensive collapsed under its own weight, and the world saw what industrial warfare looked like when perfected. December 19, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The snow had stopped, but the cold deepened. The town of Bastogne, a modest crossroads surrounded by dense forest, had become the hinge on which the German offensive turned. If it fell, the path to the Meuse would open. If it held, the German thrust would choke itself in the woods. By dawn, 7 German divisions had surrounded the town. Inside, the 101st Airborne Division, elements of the 10th Armored, and a handful of artillery and engineer units dug in. They were outnumbered 5-1. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition was rationed to a few rounds per man per day. Medical stations overflowed with wounded soldiers huddled beneath makeshift tents. German loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands. The Americans ignored them. Then came McAuliffe's reply, the single word that would echo across history: nuts. At higher command, panic briefly touched the Allied lines. Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles realized that the German offensive was far larger than initially believed. Reports poured in, destroyed bridges, captured towns, entire regiments cut off. For a few tense hours, the question emerged: was this the beginning of another Dunkirk? Then the machinery of the American war system turned on. Within 24 hours, logistics networks rerouted. Convoys in northern France were redirected toward Belgium. Thousands of trucks from the Red Ball Express, an all-black transport network that had supplied the armies since Normandy, rolled through ice and fog, carrying fuel, ammunition, and winter gear. Engineers began clearing roads under fire. Military police managed intersections like arteries, keeping the traffic flowing even as German artillery rained down. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army, was already moving. For weeks he had studied German patterns and anticipated a counterattack. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take to pivot north and relieve Bastogne, Patton answered without hesitation: 2 days. It seemed impossible. His army, over 250,000 men, with tanks, artillery, and supplies, was facing east against the Saar front. Turning north meant rerouting hundreds of miles of roads, repositioning fuel dumps, and coordinating with air support, all in winter conditions. But Patton's staff had planned for exactly this. The orders were already written. The move began instantly. Columns of Shermans and half-tracks crawled through snow-choked roads. Crews slept in their vehicles, eating cold rations and following the glow of the tank ahead. Airborne reconnaissance guided them through fog. Despite exhaustion and mechanical strain, the advance never stopped. On December 23, the skies finally cleared. The weather that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week lifted, and with it came the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts. They tore into German supply lines, strafing convoys, destroying fuel trucks, and halting reinforcements. What had been a spearpoint began to wither at its base. Inside Bastogne, American morale surged as the sound of friendly aircraft filled the air. Paratroopers cheered as C-47s dropped crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies through the snow. The wounded smiled at the sight of chocolate bars and letters from home, a lifeline from the sky. By Christmas Eve, Patton's lead elements were within striking distance. German artillery intensified, desperate to crush the pocket before relief arrived. Yet the defenders held. Every street, every field became a fortress. American artillery units outside the town, firing nearly non-stop, broke up assault after assault. The next day, tanks of the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne's southern perimeter. The siege was broken. A few hours later, Patton sent a message to Eisenhower's headquarters, "Merry Christmas." The German offensive, though still raging, had lost its momentum. Fuel shortages crippled the Panzers. Allied air power hunted anything that moved by day. The spearheads that once surged westward now found themselves stranded, exposed, and encircled. For the men in the field, the relief of Bastogne was a victory of courage. For the German High Command, it was a strategic revelation. The Americans had reacted to a massive surprise offensive faster than any modern army in history. That realization, the moment when speed and surprise failed against scale and resilience, was the day Germany truly learned why America was built different. December 26-31, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. With Bastogne relieved, the American counteroffensive began. The German advance had overextended itself. Their panzer divisions lacked fuel, their infantry was exhausted, and winter weather, once an ally, now hindered retreat. Patton's Third Army, moving at a relentless pace, smashed into the flanks of German spearheads. Columns of Shermans, backed by mechanized infantry, cut roads, captured bridges, and severed communication lines. German troops, already depleted, were forced into desperate maneuvers to regroup. In the north, Bradley's forces advanced steadily, sealing gaps, and preventing any chance of the Wehrmacht re-establishing its offensive corridor. The Allies' ability to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles, through radio, reconnaissance, and prepositioned supply depots, revealed a level of operational integration Germany could not match. The Luftwaffe, finally given clear weather to operate, managed to launch sporadic attacks, but by now the balance had shifted decisively. American anti-aircraft batteries and superior numbers overwhelmed German sorties. Key bridges that could have aided retreat or reinforcement were destroyed before German engineers could react. By December 30, the German advance had collapsed entirely. What remained of their forces retreated in disarray, abandoning tanks, artillery, and supplies to advancing Americans. The Ardennes, once the stage of a potentially decisive German victory, became a testament to endurance, adaptability, and industrial might. Every destroyed tank, every lost supply convoy reinforced the unshakable truth: Germany had underestimated America's capacity. The US was not a fragile power, dependent on temporary tactical victories. It was a nation mobilized, coordinated, and sustained across oceans, capable of replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Historians later described this period as the moment when German officers felt the weight of an unstoppable system. For the first time, commanders like Model and von Rundstedt recognized that tactical brilliance alone could not defeat industrial and logistical supremacy. The Ardennes campaign did not end the war, but it ended German illusions of parity. Hitler's gamble had failed. The Wehrmacht would never again regain strategic initiative in the West. The last day of December 1944 closed with German forces in retreat, shattered and demoralized, while American troops, weary but resolute, prepared to press onward. The system that produced tanks, men, fuel and hope had proven itself, not through flash or spectacle, but through consistent, relentless execution. In that frozen forest, Germany came to a simple, undeniable realization. America's war machine was built to endure, built to adapt, built to win. And it was nothing they could stop. January 1945 arrived over the Ardennes, bringing bitter cold and a transformed battlefield. The snow-covered forests bore silent witness to destruction, burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, and the remnants of German fortifications left by the retreating Wehrmacht. Bastogne remained intact, a symbol of resistance and resolve. Casualty reports trickled in. The United States suffered roughly 19,000 casualties, including 1,400 killed during the Battle of the Bulge. Germany, meanwhile, faced staggering losses. Estimates range from 67,000 to 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, with over 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, alongside artillery and vehicles that would never be replaced in time. The imbalance between the two forces underscored what the German command had long underestimated: America's capacity to absorb loss and continue the fight. Beyond numbers, the psychological impact was profound. German officers, previously confident in their ability to strike decisive blows, were forced to confront a reality they had avoided acknowledging. The Allies' war machine was not only vast, but resilient. Attempts to exploit tactical surprise were met with immediate adaptation and counteraction. The American side, conversely, experienced a surge of confidence. Units that had faced near-overwhelming odds were reinforced, supplied, and rotated seamlessly. Supply depots functioned like clockwork, moving fuel, ammunition, and rations to where they were most needed, often in defiance of weather and terrain. Soldiers, engineers, and pilots understood the war effort as an interconnected system, each individual action a vital part of a larger, unstoppable whole. In Europe, the Battle of the Bulge marked the last significant German offensive in the West. Strategic momentum had shifted irreversibly. The Allies would carry the war to the Rhine, and soon beyond, with resources and manpower that Germany could never match. Reports from German commanders reflected a dawning understanding. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted in his diary, "Our hopes for a decisive strike have ended. The Americans replace what we destroy faster than we can consume it. They are unlike any enemy we have faced." Even neutral observers and journalists recognized the implications. American industrial and logistical might was no longer abstract. It had been demonstrated on the battlefield, undeniable and lethal. While the soldiers on the front lines endured cold, hunger, and relentless combat, the larger war system functioned efficiently, reliably, and without pause. The Ardennes had become the stage on which America's structural advantage in manpower, production, and organization revealed itself in full force. Germany's dream of a winter victory had collapsed, leaving a stark conclusion. Their tactical brilliance could not overcome the systemic supremacy of the United States. The consequences of the Ardennes Offensive extended far beyond the battlefield. German losses in men, armor, and materiel were irreplaceable. Fuel shortages, exacerbated by destroyed supply lines and Allied bombing, crippled mobility for months. Entire divisions were rendered ineffective, forcing the Wehrmacht into defensive operations across both the western and eastern fronts. Strategically, the failed offensive accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. The Allies now held the initiative. In early 1945, American and British forces pushed across the Rhine, linking up with Soviet units advancing from the east. German high command struggled to coordinate defenses, hindered by depleted forces and shattered morale. Each lost town and bridge reinforced the growing impression that the Reich was fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Industrial superiority was the decisive factor. By the end of 1944, American production had delivered roughly 29,000 aircraft, 21,000 tanks, and over 14 million tons of supplies to Europe since D-Day. This output dwarfed the capacity of German industry, which had already suffered under Allied bombing campaigns. The contrast was undeniable. While Germany struggled to maintain equipment and feed troops, the US replaced losses with speed and precision. Beyond the numbers, the psychological impact on German troops and officers was equally significant. Soldiers who survived the Ardennes recounted the relentless flow of reinforcements, the unyielding supply convoys, and the constant presence of American artillery and air power. They realized that the enemy they faced was not just a military opponent, but a civilization fully mobilized for war. Reports from captured German officers highlighted this realization. We faced not just men, but a tide that could not be stopped. Every setback was temporary for them, every loss reversible. We were exhausted. They were endless. On the Allied side, the victory validated decades of planning and investment. The combined effectiveness of logistics, leadership, and industrial capacity demonstrated that modern warfare demanded more than tactics alone. It required coordination, resilience, and the ability to sustain operations over months and continents, attributes America had cultivated to a level Germany could not match. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes had become more than a battle. It was proof of concept, a demonstration of systemic supremacy. Germany had learned, painfully and irrevocably, that American power was not measured solely in tanks or guns, but in the depth, speed, and adaptability of the nation behind them. The collapse of the offensive did not just mark the failure of a German gamble. It marked the moment when the strategic tide of World War II decisively shifted in the West. And it was in this moment that the reality behind the phrase, "built different," became undeniable. The Battle of the Ardennes was more than a winter clash of soldiers and tanks. It was the revelation of a fundamental truth. Warfare is not only won on the front lines, but in factories, offices, and the quiet coordination of millions. Germany's last great gamble had exposed a system far beyond tactical brilliance, a nation engineered to endure, adapt, and outlast its adversary. America's advantage was invisible at first. Its soldiers fought bravely, but what truly mattered was the machine behind them. Supply lines that never ceased, production that replaced loss faster than it occurred, and leadership that trusted initiative while maintaining cohesion. Every logistical calculation, every railroad timetable, every factory shift became as lethal as any shell fired in the Ardennes. The human dimension remained central. Ordinary citizens, women and men across a continent, contributed to an effort larger than themselves. Engineers, truck drivers, code talkers, factory workers, all formed an interconnected network of resilience. This was a civilization that could sustain war on a scale Germany could never match, because it was built not for short bursts of brilliance, but for endurance and adaptation. History would remember the Ardennes as the turning point in the West, a moment when German planners recognized the limits of their own system and the unyielding scale of their opponent. The lessons were stark. Innovation and tactics are vital, but without a foundation of infrastructure, industrial capacity, and national cohesion, even the most brilliant offensive will falter. And so, in the frozen forests of Belgium, amidst snow, smoke, and shattered steel, the world witnessed the emergence of a new model of warfare, one defined not by temporary advantage or fleeting genius, but by a nation's ability to persist, replace, and endure, a nation unmistakably, undeniably built different.